Hi, everybody. Welcome to Speakers Who Think Differently with Michael Barris. I'm Michael Barris, and as you can see, I have the amazing, legendary entrepreneur and kindness advocate, Gary C. Laney. Welcome, Gary. Nice to have you here.
Michael, it's so good to be with you. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to be here.
How do you feel about me identifying you as a kindness advocate?
Definitely a running theme throughout my life. So definitely, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll get back to that in a moment. Right now, I want to give the listeners here who are eager to hear some kind of public speaking tip the value they came for. So right away, Gary, if you could give them one piece of advice to help them to become more stronger, more compelling speakers in business, what would the tip be?
So, Mike, I've been speaking for 33 years. I mean, there was a time where I spoke professionally every day, for almost 4 years. What I think the biggest tip I can give you is that you need to find a way to make what you say believable, not only to the audience, but to yourself. You have to be yourself. You have to be in yourself. And the theme has to be something you really strongly believe in that has impact in your own life. So if you can talk from personal experience about something, it's going to come across as something that you really, truly understand, that can be impactful for someone else. So I think that's it. It's a very simple formula. You can have lots of themes, lots of great things that you prepare for. But even the great Zig Ziglar would spend sometimes days preparing for a talk that he knew so well that he's given, 30, 40 times because he wanted it to come from him, not from the written word that he had prepared. So I think that's kind of my high level, bar for trying to hit in a good speech.
Now, we've been talking on LinkedIn for a couple of years, I guess now. And one thing I always kind of admire that I think we have something in common, which is that I think we demand a certain amount of self-knowledge from people to get good at what they're doing, whether it's public speaking or whether it's becoming a leader. Wouldn't you say that's true in your case?
Totally agree with that. I think that's very important.
Your book kind of made me think, wow, I understand the concepts, but you have, I think, essentially 3 keys for people to becoming a leader. And let me see now. One is you have to know, I forget the term you use for it, but you have to know your knowledge, your experience, and your expertise. You have to know your driving forces, which is the reason you do what you do, your why, as it were. And then you have to know what makes you competitive. And I think competitive means how to survive in the business environment, I'm assuming. But do people know that right away? I mean, it seems to me that business becomes a process of trial and error, figuring things out as you're going along. Aren't I right?
Well, obviously, and I'll just define a little bit of what you talked about. So the 3 aspects you talk about they're not really structurally presented the way you talked about, but as you read the book and you get through with it, you'll see, there are really 3 main things. One is my personal value, which was what you talked about. It's my experience, it's my expertise, it's my knowledge, my education. That's your value. When you go to someone, they look and say, what value can you bring? You actually should ask yourself throughout your life, before you get a job, when you're looking for the next job, what value, what difference can I make, to this organization, to this staff that I'd be managing. So personal value begins, and then we go to what really helps you to survive, like you talked about. What are my personal driving forces, which is my purpose, my passion, my motivation? Why do I do what I do? When you become a leader, you have to define that in all the roles you have, because leaders are typically people that have many roles. They run an organization, they're on boards, they're in associations, they're involved in charities, and they're a family man or person or woman. So those purposes have to drive you, because when things get tough and when you start to look at what's going on, you have to say, is it worth going forward? And you say, yes, because I know what I'm doing for this reason. The final one is what I call competencies, competitive competencies. Means, okay, are you competitive? Can you compete? Can you lead? Can you perform? And so you have to look at there's many, I've surveyed, for 2 years now, over 1,000 leaders, and asked them what competency is important to you as a leader that would really make a difference. And every one of them have different ones, because it's what you bring to the table. It's what you are competitively, showing when you are a leader. Sometimes you don't have the competitiveness, and you have to step back and say, here are 10 I really want to develop. and rate yourself 1 to 10 on all those competencies. And then which ones do I have, I think, the best chance of acquiring, of mastering? And perhaps there's even one that you can master better than all and you'll become well known for. And I'm going to call it a superpower because I think that's a good way to look at it, even though it sounds like a cartoon characteristic. But I think it's important to say, I have this ability to do something and impact in this way, maybe better than most people. And I think that's an important thing to achieve.
Now, you say that you've been in business actively for something like 35 years, and that these concepts that undergird your book, by the way, we should mention the name of it. What's it called? It's called Strategic Influence. What's the name of the book, Gary? It's
called The Power of Strategic Influence.
Right. Pardon me. The Power of Strategic Influence. Okay. Thank you. And,
Sure.
And these are just ideas that evolved from your experiences with dealing with employees or working for yourself, because we were going to get into your whole career as a so-called serial entrepreneur in a moment. But I know that your family also had an enormous influence on you as well. Aren't I right?
I think it was 2 questions you're asking me. One, let's talk about my family. So
okay,
during COVID, I just sold a company called Trustegrity. I'm big in building business communities, and I'm starting to do that again. And we built groups of business people that meet on a monthly basis all over the United States. So now I'm involved in doing that again since my non-compete has expired. So I was doing nothing because the stuff I do requires you to meet in person, and COVID wasn't allowing us to do that. And so my daughter, my wife, and my granddaughter, who were writing books, said, "Why don't you join us and write?" And I've been wanting to write a book for 15 years. I got 5 titles, and I've written one. I'm on the process of writing my second. And so I thought, okay, let's see how far I get into this. I had no aspirations of actually finishing it. I had no idea if it would take years. I had no idea if I'd even have something I would want to publish and share with the world. But during the process, I first started with this gentleman who does research for me and editing and helps me. And we wrote the first chapter and it just didn't go well. And so I said, okay, I have to stop everything and I have to find out who I am before I write the rest of this book, because this is starting to sound like a research project. And I don't want this to be a book that I researched and I gave data about. So I gave him a break for almost 2 months. I decided to do a survey to see if my principles, the things I've been teaching for 30 plus years, were still valid and modern, and I needed aspects of what true leaders are saying is required today to develop influence. And I got lots of input. That's where the competency part came in my survey, as well as definitions of what influence is, lots of different ideas on that idea. And then I got back into it. One night I stayed up the entire night, not because I was not feeling well, it's because I was passionate about figuring out what this roadmap was going to look like. So I called it my table of contents roadmap, stayed up all night, and I figured out exactly the process, because I looked at my life and said, what was the step-by-step process that it took for me to get to the position I'm in? And I'm influential. I'm not the most influential. I have a certain level of expertise and influence and leadership. And so that became the project. What is the step-by-step sphere of influence by sphere of influence, success factor by success factor, 10 of them, that will make you influential if you really want to be? How do you do it? And so it's really a story of my life, Mike. If you look at it, it started out with me trying to get a perspective. How do I approach my life where I want to become a leader? I want to be a business owner. And I've been involved in 20 startups. How do you do that? Luckily, I grew up in a family where my father taught me all the aspects of business from the time I was a little boy until I was in my 20s. And I actually bought his last story so he could retire. I really had a perspective a lot of people didn't have. I really felt like I could get into it. So when I went to business school, it was pretty easy for me. In fact, they let me waive most of my business topics so I could go into other topics I was interested in. I ended up with a triple major. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, so back to the book. I mean, that's how it evolved. And then, oh, by the way, one last thing I have to say is Stephen Covey had a huge impact on me. So I read a book of Stephen Covey when I was 19 that no one's ever heard of, called Spiritual Roots of Human Relations. He was a human relations expert.
I have a picture of him.
There you go. Great man. Died in 2012. Is a great loss to the world. But he was number one, an author that I read about, and I was fascinated on how he deals with people and how they should relate to each other and help each other, how relationships evolve. If you take that book and compare it to his famous book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you'll see that there's a lot of comparable similarities. Even some of the charts are the same, and no one even knows that. So I mean, he started when he was in his 20s writing that book. He was only 26 or something when he wrote that book, and then he was a brilliant guy. And then he wrote 7 Habits later, which caught on with Oprah and everything else. I've known him for 10 years. Most of the principles he teaches in that book, he taught to my salespeople, who were kind of guinea pigs for all the stuff that he taught. And I have taught his stuff for 35 years. Over that time period, I was able to extend many of the principles because his is more philosophical. Mine needed to be practical, pragmatic, so I could lead sales teams and perform highly, especially when I was working for public companies that required you to hit your numbers every quarter so your stock would go up. And so, you know, I've just been a super advocate of this kind of principle, influence, but strategic influence, which we can talk about, not the transactional social media influence that a lot of people talk about.
Now, when you wrote this book, you went out and interviewed something like 12 CEOs, correct, of companies?
I interviewed more than 12. I chose 12 to be in the book.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so I didn't know where I was going to stop. I thought I would only have like 4. And then I ended up with 12 chapters. I said, you know, wouldn't it be nice to have one CEO, a national, globally known CEO, at the end of each of my chapters that through our interview we figured out had some content, some substance that related to that chapter. And so another night I spent trying to match all that stuff up. Some of them asked to be in some chapters. I thought that was cool. And it just turned out magically, I think, on my part.
Well, one question I wanted to ask you is that given your worldview of what constitutes a good leader, is there anybody out there who you would say is a model, perfect model for it?
Depends on what competency we're talking about.
Okay.
I mean, innovation, I'd say Elon Musk, right? And there's others that fit that category too. But, you know, there's so many competencies. The competencies are, you know, shared vision, you know, strategic thinking. So I think you have to look at the leaders out there and say, what is their superpower? What really do they bring to the table? And I think that's, you could probably, everybody would have their favorite. So
the interesting thing about Musk is that he does fit the profile of a serial entrepreneur. And an important aspect of that, Gary, maybe you agree with this, is the willing to accept the possibility of risk, living with risk, financial risk. I mean, would you agree with that? That to me seems to be a major aspect.
He was PayPal. He was one of the leaders there. I mean, big leaders, and he ended up with 130 million. Was it 130 or 170 million? I forget. And he took the entirety of that investment that he got out of it and put it in 3 companies. X Space, of course, Tesla. What's the third one? I forget right now. But
SpaceX. Did you say SpaceX?
Yeah, SpaceX. I said X Space. Sorry, SpaceX.
Yeah.
And then there was a third one. God, what is it? Anyway, maybe it's the stuff he's doing with all the mobile homes and stuff. I forget. But he invested it all. At one point, this guy was living on nothing. He was barely surviving because he'd invested everything he had. And so, yeah, I think risk has a lot to do with it. And he thought that he had, you know, 1 in 10 chance of the SpaceX thing surviving, and it came down to the last launch. I remember hearing, and it was successful, and now it's, you know, worth 100 billion or something. I don't know what it's worth. And same thing with Tesla. I mean, he's got a vision, and he's betting on his vision, and he really goes all out, of course, to make it work.
All right. So now you famously have, let me understand, you bought, improved, and sold roughly 23 companies or 23 businesses over 35 years.
Only 12. I've been in 20 startups, probably
Right.
21, which I was involved in, you know, as an executive, and had some ownership. But there were 12 that I specifically was the owner, and I was mostly the CEO in most of those. And I bought them, grew them, developed them, and sold them.
So give us an example of some typical Gary C. Laney type of projects?
So I left high tech in 2004, and I was in the middle of building this multi-million-dollar house, and I joined a partnership in a sales training company, the partnership didn't work out, and I wrote a whole section of my book about how to develop a trust-based partnership, because mine wasn't that. So I was in a predicament because I was leaving my partnership and still had, this multi-million-dollar project I was working on. My wife was a little concerned. So I told her not to worry. I said, listen, I've been building stuff for other people for 30 years. I can certainly do it myself and help us survive. So I went on a journey across the US. I evaluated over 200 businesses in a 3-month period. And I had, savings and some backup money to support that. And I narrowed it down to 10 businesses, and I bought 7 of them all at the same time, within a month. And I decided just to follow the money. So I was at that point, just like in my book, where you're starting from scratch. You don't know what to do. You have to rely on people that can give you influence because you don't have it in the industries you're going into. And I bought a series of businesses, small ones, anywhere. I was paying anywhere from like 10, 20,000 up to 70, 80,000 for a business. I think I spent 250 in total. So because I wanted to know, but I only bought things I thought had potential. And I just followed the money. Some of them were very related. So examples, I bought, my wife was interested in fashion. So we bought one of the first fashion blogs that was kind of still new, and she took it over and ran it for the next 15 years. And, we were making at some point, 150,000 from that one little business. And she was having a great time. She was managing a bunch of other people editing or writing, and she was editing everything. That's one business. Then we bought a related business, with wedding dress design, and we were having the dresses made in China. I was having a ball because we were just doing things I'd never done before, even though I grew up in retail. So I kind of had a sense of how to sell anything. And my dad had a mercantile. And then I bought something called babychangingstations.com.
Mm-hmm.
I almost didn't buy it. The guy that owned it was in New York. Good guy, but he wasn't succeeding. He was going to shut it down. And he's offering it at a pretty low price. And so I looked at it and I said, I just don't think that's my cup of tea. But I thought about it. I made a plan. I said, how can I make it successful? I went to him. I said, I don't know if I'm going to buy it. He said, well, if you don't buy it, can you share your plan with me? I said, I'm going to buy it. So I bought it. And then I built it into a multi-million-dollar business over the next 7 or 8 years. It was a super successful thing for me. I didn't buy Koala. It was the Koala brand baby changing stations. But I bought one of their small distributorships and became one of the top 3 in the world before it was over. So those are 2 or 3 of the businesses we owned. Kind of related. It was fun. And I built them to a point, and then I sell them and moved on. So then I got into business networking after that.
And where would babychangingstations.com's products be found at the time?
Babychangingstations.com.
No, you mean, I see. It wasn't like a thing where you'd go into rest stations off the highway or something and see it like that.
Well, you do. They're everywhere. And I sold, tens of thousands of them in 8 years. When China had their Olympics and it was the Shanghai airport that everybody was flying into, I can forget. I sold all those baby changing stations. I was a corporate guy. So the guy before me didn't approach it the way I did. I started going after corporate accounts. I sold to Intel. I sold to places he would never think of. He was selling to contractors and people that wanted to put something in their church. And I thought those were good ideas. We can have repeat orders. I was looking for, these reoccurring revenue opportunities that people would buy from me all the time. And it turned out fantastic. I kind of wish I hadn't sold it at the time because I was doing so well. But I was ready for a break and ready to do something new.
So was one of your criteria often a business that didn't necessarily have a lot of employees, require a lot of manpower?
Yeah, thank you. I was looking for something that could be run remotely wherever I was in the world. I remember going to Europe on a trip. I'd check in once a day. My orders would come in and they were drop shipped by somebody else. I didn't have to touch the shipments. I could if I wanted to, and we did a certain amount of that. But when I traveled, it was 100% handled for me, 100%. And so, we had customer issues where the stuff came in, but we weren't gone for more than a couple of weeks usually. And I had some outsourced stuff. I had a call center that took my calls. I only got involved when I needed to. So yeah, the remote part was important to me, but I did have some local part-time employees. I had outsourced people that worked for me, and I handled our entire. Now my wife's business was different. She'd hired writers for her fashion blog. One of the most famous fashion blogs out there at the time, called shesheme.com. We finally shut it down after about 17 years because it just was outdated a little bit. But yeah, I mean, all of us could do everything remotely, even if we had some employees.
Well, I just want to encourage those who are watching, if you have any questions, put them into comments, because we got Gary here. I know we'll deal with them right as they come up. Gary, one thing I'm wondering about is, I know that you have had a long time interest in sports. You yourself, you played football, you played high school wrestling or college. You were a college wrestler?
How do you know I played football?
I think you told me that.
Oh, I did. Okay. So yeah, I did football, track, and wrestling and weightlifting in college. So I mean, I did 3 sports in college.
College wrestling. That's interesting. Well, the reason I ask is that I'm kind of wondering how, look, I understand that in business, well, people do business to make money. Now, I know you're going to have a comment on that in a moment, but I can't help thinking, did you just do it for sport? Like, or for the thrill of going from one thing to another? Because let's face it, most people in a lifetime, they may only own one business or maybe a couple, not necessarily 23.
Well, anybody that knows me, anybody that ever hired me to be a VP of sales or a sales leader knows that I'm in it for, I hate to say it, the kill, or I'm in it for the acquisition, for the growth. I'm just not a farmer type salesperson, they call them. I was more of an elephant hunter. And so I went after the big accounts. I was very, very good at navigating to the top to get to the decision makers. That's one of the reasons why I can teach about influence, because I know what that takes. I did it for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it wasn't the sport. I can call it the sport. I mean, I'm really into the acquisition part of acquiring new clients. That really is really my game. And other people want to take something and farm it, maintain it. It interests me. And so after I got to that point where I was thinking I'm going to just have to maintain this, I lose interest and I go on to something new. So it's either a fallacy or, it's either a weakness or a strength. You can call it what you want.
Well, obviously you keep going because, as I said, it takes a certain personality to deal with the uncertainty of how your investment's going to turn out. It seems to me, right? And I imagine, were you like Musk? Were you at a point where everything was like stretched out to the max?
Well, I've never compared myself to Musk because he is amazing, but absolutely. When I were building this multi-million-dollar home and I left my partnership, I had some reserves that would last for months, but not much longer, and to keep paying for the $1 million+ loan that I had taken out. And so yeah, we were stretched, and my wife was concerned, and I just jumped into full gear. Said, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to come back with solutions. I'm going to have options. It's the way I shop when I go shopping. I don't like to shop. When I go, I'll put a bunch of stuff out, and then I make choices. I don't like to just sit there and meander. I get it done, So I think that's what kind of my mental mode that I go into.
Well, one other character trait I've observed is that you like to bring people together, and I happen to know that that's necessary when you're an entrepreneur as well. Listen, it's relationships and building them, and
right on.
Am I right?
Yeah, I'm really huge on relationships. And I started with Stephen Covey when I was 19, reading his book, and I've learned that listen, if you build trust-based relationships where you can rely on each other, when things get tough, you really can go to each other and say, I need help. Can you help me? And then you are always there for them. You're there to reciprocate whatever happens. And then a team, I think the people that work for me, I've managed almost 2,000 sales support and customer service and professional service people in my lifetime. There are a lot of people that say I was their best manager. I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying I took it seriously as a manager. I was very serious about making sure the team felt that they were included in many of the decisions we did. When we did a plan, when we talked about goals, it was always bubbling up to the top, not being forced down from the top. I was very collaborative in everything. I always made sure they felt like they were part of it. When they did something, I didn't even care sometimes that they were performing as high as they needed to in the revenue scheme, because I knew they had the potential. And so if they got into a new market and sold something that we all could learn from, I recognized them. So recognition was huge in my training days, and trying to create records we can all break. So we had a lot of fun, very collaborative. We all pulled together when we needed to hit our goals. I never missed my goals, not one time.
Good for you.
But I'll tell you that the biggest thing I learned in business with those teams is that a couple of the companies I worked for, and I won't mention them, had practices by some leaders to fabricate cells so that they could report them and that the stock wouldn't be affected. And I wouldn't do that. I had them come to me and say, you need to go to your resellers or whatever and ask them to produce some POs, purchase orders, and they can bring in those later, but they have to send them to us so we can count them. And they had nothing behind them, no sales, no customer behind them. And I just wouldn't do it. I lost an opportunity to be VP of sales for a public company because I didn't do that. And another time I was bypassed because I was supposed to agree to help fabricate some financials, which I would not be part of. I brought a customer to our company they needed, and they were sold. I had them sold. And they wanted me to, because they knew our financials didn't have a long runway. It's always a runway. How much money do you have in the bank so you can last? Mm-hmm. And they're always, they bought from me because they liked being on the bleeding edge. And so I didn't think they were going to care too much that we only had a year or year and a half of funding left. But my leaders wanted to make it look much better, so they would buy. It was a big deal to our company. It was a $500,000 deal. So I said, I won't be part of it. I didn't go to the meeting. I said, I will not be part of that. And I just feel in my life, in my business, that I can say honestly that I didn't do that kind of stuff. I wasn't deceptive.
And I know you've written that money can't be the purpose you live for. Right? You've written that, correct?
Well, yeah, I write in the book, I'll say, listen, money can't be the purpose. You have purposes, you have driving forces that I call them. Money can't be one of those. It can be the result of your purpose, your motivation, your passion, and the things you're working for. But when it comes to a time where you have to make hard decisions, where it's challenging, money won't be enough, because if money stops, you'll leave. Otherwise, you stick with it, you make it happen, and you come back. And I've turned around a lot of businesses. Most of those businesses that I bought and invested in were turnaround situations, and I loved it. I just loved that situation. So yeah, I think you're right, Mike. I mean, I really believe that money can't be the purpose of why you do things.
Well, as you pointed out, that won't necessarily see you through the hard times. It's really understanding the deeper motivation, isn't it?
It is. It's what's deep down that says, I love doing this. I believe in this. I'm going to keep going. I can live on less for the certain amount of time. I've done that, a few times, and it always panned out for me. I've always survived. It's always been it may not have been exactly what I wanted, and at some point I would sell it, but I didn't do it until I felt like I was on good footing before I did it.
All right, we're getting near the end of this, I think. Is there anything you'd want to say to folks who wanted to go into business and they have high ambitions, but they wouldn't mind hearing a little of advice from somebody seasoned like yourself? What would it be?
Well, I mean, there's so many aspects of that question. I think number one, are you willing to count the cost up front, which means if things get tough, have you made the decision to move forward? And so you've already made a decision. Things get challenging, you're willing to go through it because you already know why. So I think that's number one. Number two, when you go into business, you're going to wear a lot of hats, especially when you're in a startup. And so you have to know that you're not going to get paid for each of those hats. So it can be tough, but it's also exciting. I mean, I just got so much, thrill out of doing stuff like that, where you can get involved, you can build something that nobody else touched, and you can take ownership for that. It's a lot of pleasure. There's a lot of fulfillment that comes with that. What I would say is that, especially if you're going to get into partnership with someone, and I teach this in my book, I have 6 building blocks of a trust-based partnership. I'll just give you the first three items. First one is when you give us someone, obviously you're going to have the same goals. You're both excited about something, about building this business. You think it's a good idea. The second one, though, is kind of the telling one, and that's, do you have the same strategy for getting there? And a lot of times partners disagree on how to get there, how to do it, how to market it, how to build the structure of the business. The third one is interesting because some people think we can just exist and we'll do our own parts for the business and we don't have to communicate much. I had a person tell me that 2 years ago. I was starting this business a year and a half ago, but she didn't feel like we needed to talk every week. I said, oh my gosh, we're going to be in a partnership. We have to talk regularly. And it has to be so that we can, keep things on track. So there's so many aspects of that question, Mike. What I would just say in simplicity is do something that excites you, that you believe in. That's so important. Don't just do it for the money. If it looks like it's making money, but you don't really like it, it's not something you're excited about, don't do it. So, I mean, it has to be within yourself, something that you believe in, that you want to do, that you think you'd enjoy. I mean, that will help you more than anything, as a simple answer.
And one final question. What does the C stand for in Gary C. Laney?
Not to be disclosed.
That is no one knows.
All right. Gary C. Just call me C. Gary C. That's it.
It has a nice ring to it, right? Well, let's call Gary C. He'll know.
My dad had the same name. He didn't like it. I said, why'd you give it to me? So no, I don't disclose my middle name, unfortunately.
All right, well, this has been fun. The time flew by. I'd like to thank you for being with us. Next week, I'm going to be speaking with Jen Deal, the amazing life coach. So stick around for that one. She's also a trademark lawyer who's very knowledgeable in that area. And thanks again, Gary.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. And goodbye, everybody. So long. Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.